Greetings, planet Earth. Papadopoulos here for the next hour and 40 minutes or so, talking about the stories that we think you need to know about with our facts as best we can establish them, our opinions as best we can express them, and absolutely great guests. Do join with the discussion by going to thepulse.today, and you can have your say there too. Thank you, all the regulars who are there. Grumpy old woman, I see you there. Little Miss L. Dialogue between the two of you. Just caught a bit of Lembit on a hot mic, then he disappeared again, says Grumpy old woman. I sound like either the Pimpernel or one of those rare big cats that people spot in Cornwall in England. I am here, I can assure you. Been here since the start of the hour. He's at the local pub dancing club. LOL, says Mark Parkinson. LOL, of course, being Lembertopic live, I suppose. All fake, says Eileen. Well, I've just proved it's not, haven't I? I could still be AI, of course, Eileen. And Mark said, called on the telephone. LOL, did you? Oh, dear. Well, that's not very good. Anyway, welcome. In this hour, we're going to be talking about the latest developments with the clown show, also known as Zelensky in Europe versus the grown-ups. As Donald Trump says that Zelensky had years to make a deal with Putin, but refused to do so. We'll also be talking about Starmer's antics. Every day, Starmer looks less and less credible, in my opinion, in the international world. We'll get some expert opinion on that. In the next hour, we have one of the giants of green campaigning. That's Ben Pyle, who'll really sock it to him. Honestly, the level of farce that's coming out of this government now is breathtaking when it comes to the climate. And then at the end, did you know that unwanted staring is going to be a criminal offence, a sexual offence? Unwanted staring. You heard me right. We've got a lawyer and friend to the Pulse.today, Peter Morn, coming to explain what that is and what he would do if one of his clients was defending against that charge. Unwanted staring. That's what Britain's come to. But we start with a great friend of common sense, actually, Marcus Papadopoulos, who is an expert in Russian politics, history, and relations. Marcus, great to join us. Great you are able to join us today. Very interesting day, though, because we now got Vladimir Zelensky accusing Trump of being hoodwinked by the Russians. Could it be that he's the one who's been hoodwinking Europe, or am I being a cynic?
Well, first of all, let me say, Lembit, that anyone who values human life, peace, mankind, and civilization should support and applaud the efforts of the Trump administration to bring about peace in Ukraine. Whatever your thoughts about Trump are, or indeed whatever your thoughts about Putin are, peace trumps everything else. Now, turning to Zelensky, firstly, Zelensky and his government are puppets of the Western ruling elites, or what Trump refers to as deep state. Thus, Zelensky and his government are beholden to the deep state, and receives their instructions from the deep state. Secondly, the fact that Zelensky is openly criticizing Trump's efforts to bring about a peaceful negotiation to the war in Ukraine demonstrates that Trump is not fully in charge in America. And why should he be? He has only been president for a few weeks now. And whilst he has signed some very powerful and very effective executive orders, nonetheless, the deep state in America remains entrenched in power. That is why Zelensky is speaking as he is about Trump, because Zelensky takes his orders from the deep state. No different to how this week in Paris, we saw the dreadful, pathetic spectacle of Starmer, Macron, and others assemble in Paris in an attempt to derail the Trump administration's efforts to find peace in Ukraine. Why did they go there? They did not go there on their own accord. Starmer, Macron, like Zelensky, are puppets. They received their instructions from their masters and they made their way to Paris. Finally, let me say this, Lembit. The very fact that in Britain today, if you support peace, if you oppose war, you are demonized by politicians and mainstream journalists. That demonstrates how rotten, indeed dead, British society is. That is inversion at its most inverted. Again, if you support peace, you are vilified. I don't believe people in Britain from, say, 50 or 60 years ago would ever have believed that people who support peace would be vilified, would be demonized. Again, it demonstrates that Britain is dead.
I have to say, your impassioned criticism is something I, with regret, agree with. It's inconceivable 50 or 60 years ago that Britain wouldn't be in the room with America making a plan. But equally, it would be inconceivable that Britain would make such asinine decisions to support the losing side in a war which was essentially provoked by the West in the first place. I was speaking to a journalist this morning, Marcus, and he asked me, enthralled, so you're telling me that the West was responsible for the attack by Russia? I said, isn't it obvious? Don't you know anything about this? And it seems to me also that the collusion between the media and our mainstream politicians is a rearguard action to save face at a time when Trump's done more, as you say, in 4 weeks than Biden did in 4 years.
If we take Britain, democracy is dead here. Freedom of speech is dead here. We are told by the British ruling elite through their useful idiots such as Starmer or before him Sunak that you must support immigration, you must support multiculturalism, you must support BLM, you must support LGBTQ, you must support net zero, you must support Israel, you must be anti-Putin, you must be pro-Zelensky, you must be anti-Palestine, and so on and so on. That is not evidence of a democratic and free country. Worse still, if you have a different opinion about, for example, the causes of the war in Ukraine, then you are disparaged, you are denigrated, you are referred to by politicians and mainstream journalists as Russian propagandists or Putin apologists, or even more dangerously, as having blood on your hands. That is a dire state of affairs. And these people who are talking about Ukraine know nothing about that country. Indeed, they know nothing about the history of Eastern Europe. Why is it so inconceivable that perhaps, just perhaps, the war broke out in Ukraine because of NATO? Why is that inconceivable? When there is so much tangible evidence to support the notion that the tension between America and Russia revolves around NATO expansion. And yet we are told, on the contrary, Russia is at fault. And if you do not support that, then you have blood on your hands. That is a very dangerous society to be living in. And quite frankly, when you are told, when you are accused by the media, who have an audience of tens of millions, of having blood on your hands, that, in my opinion, is potentially inciting violence against people who hold a different opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It seems to me, I know that I nearly lost a job. I was doing some temporary work for a client. I nearly lost a job, which had absolutely nothing to do with the Ukraine situation, but simply because one of their team had observed me trying to highlight the misdemeanors of NATO and the fact that Putin may have had a point because he warned he was going to do something if NATO broke its promise from 1990. We do seem to be in a very dark place now, Marcus, where the losing side, which is all those people like Starmer and the Europeans and Zelensky, cannot accept and almost seem to want the talks between Trump and Putin to fail. Do you have that impression?
I most certainly do have that impression. I mean, the likes of Starmer, Macron, etc., alone cannot derail the Trump administration's efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. But as I said earlier on, the aforementioned individuals are not acting on their own accord. They are acting on the instructions of the deep state, or what I call the Western ruling elites. So whilst we can refer to their meeting in Paris this week as pathetic, we should not take for granted the possibility that the efforts by the Trump administration could be derailed, not because of Starmer, etc., per se, but because the deep state is entrenched in power. And the deep state and the British ruling elite, however you want to describe those who rule, not govern, rule the Western world, they are not going to lie back and do nothing against Trump. After all, whilst Trump is not a savior, whilst he's anything but perfect, he does pose a threat. He is anti-war. So the deep state or the Western ruling elites will be working around the clock to try and ruin his efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. So unless Trump, in his own words, starts to rapidly drain the swamp in America, then it is conceivable, or more than conceivable, that efforts to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine could fail. So again, we must be very, very alive to the possibility that in spite of the efforts of the Trump administration, they could fail.
That's interesting. And you're the first person who's so lucidly outlined the belief that you've described, that Zelensky's emboldened to stand up to Trump because he's basically got deep state backing in America. Is there any way that Trump can drain that swamp and expose the true progenitors of this unwinnable war in Ukraine from the American side?
It will take a lot longer than 4 years to remedy the damage, the enormous damage which has been inflicted by the deep state in America. Thus, Trump must build a foundation upon which that his successor and the successor after that will repair the damage. It will take not 4 years, it won't take 8 years, it won't take 12 years, it will take decades, because after all, the damage has been accumulated over a period of many, many years. So it all depends how quickly Trump starts to purge the deep state, in particular from the military, the intelligence community, and the State Department. So it is possible. After all, Trump and Putin are talking. That is quite a development. That was inconceivable just a few months ago. And in my lifetime, Lembit, and I am 46 years of age, I have never witnessed an American president say and sincerely say that he is opposed to war. Americans voted for Bush Jr., or they voted for Obama, or they voted for Biden, etc., and they got the same thing, namely war after war after war. So the very fact that we have an American president today who is anti-war and is trying to bring about an end to a major conflict really is a remarkable achievement. And again, we should support that and applaud that. But by God, the road ahead for the Trump administration is very long and will be very dangerous. Again, the deep state is not going to lie back and do nothing. They will fight, and no doubt they will fight ferociously, but behind the scenes. So again, when Starmer and the rest of them met in Paris this week, that was on the orders of the deep state or the globalists in general. And on their own, they can't derail the attempt to bring peace to Ukraine. But the deep state is, of course, a phenomenally powerful entity. So it is not for certain the Trump administration will succeed. Also, the Russian side has many demands. And can Trump meet those demands? It could be that it's too early on in his presidency. Only time.
Have a longer conversation next week, if that's all right, Marcus. But that leads me to the central question for today. Donald Trump, Putin, scheduled to meet. Putin saying something else that's inconceivable from 2 months ago, that he's looking forward to meeting Trump with pleasure. I personally like it when world leaders talk and when they get on. Is there any downside to Trump's approach, or is it the case that Zelensky essentially is a puppet and therefore is fundamentally irrelevant to any strategic peace talks between America and Russia?
Zelensky is utterly irrelevant. He is a puppet. He was selected and installed by the deep state or the Western ruling elites. People often in the Western world talk about the first election, which he stood in. Well, in that election, all the political parties in Ukraine, which did not pursue an anti-Russia objective or pursuit, were banned and have been banned ever since. So that election that Zelensky won was not a free and fair election. But again, Zelensky is irrelevant. He is a puppet. We need to understand that Vladimir Putin did not wake up one morning and decide that he will invade Ukraine. The problem has been ongoing since the late 1990s, when NATO began to expand into Eastern Europe, which by the early 2000s took the Western military bloc up to the western border of the Russian Federation. And the argument in the West by puppets such as politicians and journalists, that NATO is a peaceful, defensive military bloc is untenable. For example, in 1999, NATO bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in support of Albanian terrorists. When NATO bombed Yugoslavia, they didn't just violate international law. NATO violated its own founding treaty. Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty stipulates clearly that NATO will never resort to force to end a dispute. So NATO is not a peaceful defensive military bloc. In regards to Ukraine, I sincerely hope that peace can be brought to that country. Anyone who does not support that clearly has a very serious problem in life. And the fact that the likes of you and I, Lembit, are vilified, have our names dirtied because we support peace over war, really says something about the Britain we live in. And it really says something about the nature of people at the Houses of Parliament and the nature of the people who comprise British mainstream media.
Thank you so much, Marcus. We'll leave it there for now, but hopefully we'll have a slightly longer conversation perhaps next week as we see these things developing.